Oh, it's our big Thursday show. I love our Thursday show almost as much as I like the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday show. And then there's a moment at which it puts me into another place, and that moment has just arrived, luckily for you. One of the great legal analysts in the English-speaking world is about to join us. You've heard him on British radio and television, and New Zealand and Australia, across America, on Fox News, on News Nation, on all of these CBS stations in New York, on Fox, in Los Angeles, etc. And he joins us on Thursdays to set us straight on the law. He's the great former federal prosecutor. Now he works the defense side of the table. David Katz, everybody.
Mark, it's great to be with you because we go so in depth, on your show.
I thank you, and I am craving a lot of your takes on what's happening with the law. And we've seen this undermining of decisions that were made to incarcerate or otherwise punish so many of these J6ers, the people who stormed the Capitol and perpetrated violence, and also those who found themselves there in the halls of Congress and they participated in violence to one level or another. Some didn't participate in violence and they got trespassing charges and these kinds of things. But when you see the heads of all of this, I'm talking about the Proud Boys, these clear militia group leaders who did help engineer so much violence and this attempted coup against the country. When you see that just all wiped away with these blanket pardons, I wonder if you could speak to it and put it in some kind of context. There's been blowback, last thing, by judges who were involved with this. There were Trump judges, okay? These are people who Trump appointed who presided over many of these cases. You've seen the police union now break back against it. It was a real, I'm going to use this phrase, balls move on the part of Trump to make this one of his first orders of business, and yet he did say he was going to do it.
Well, it's extraordinarily controversial, even among the usual fans of the Republican Party, like the police unions and so forth. It's really an extraordinary move after using this slogan my entire life, back the blue, law and order, all of those canards of the Republican Party. And this shows that they were utterly wanting in that regard. They didn't stand up for the police who got beaten. So all of this rhetoric for all of these years, he's just made such fools of the Republicans who use that rhetoric against so many other people. And then here is a classic example where it should have been used. Here are people on film, on video, shown to have beaten these police officers. You have 5 dead police officers who would not be dead if it were not for this marauding, this attack on the Capitol by Trump's followers, which Trump instigated. He's also made a fool out of the Vice President, Vance. Of course, Vance will get used to being made a fool of probably weekly, to the extent that he has any credibility or he says anything or he steps out of the shadow of Musk and actually acts like he's the person who's supposed to be second in command of this circus. But he said, no, we'll do a case-by-case analysis. And other people said, oh, no, we'll do a case-by-case study of these. And of course, there was no case-by-case analysis. It was ordered, Mark, en masse as to 1,500 people, all of whom were either convicted or had felony charges pending against them at this time, not having been deemed to worthy of being dismissed by any federal judge. No federal judge, as I understand it, dismissed any of these charges. The reason that these 1,500 people have now been exonerated, have been excused, is because they either got full pardons, that was the great majority of them. They got commutations. That includes people who were leaders of the Proud Boys, leaders of the Oath Keepers, who planned this, who were given multi-decade sentences in these because of the, as I said, 5 people died there. They tried to overturn the election. They tried to take away our transition of power, one of the great jewels, if not the greatest jewel of our democracy, that we have a peaceful transfer of power.
Well, they tried to, and as you say, they tried to beat to death the law enforcement officers who were charged with defending that building.
I mean, Mark, they sprayed bear spray at them, caused huge damage them, hurt their eyes, hurt their minds.
They tased them. They tased that Fanon
Yes,
multiple times in his neck. I mean,
yes.
they try. So I'm sorry to, but to not to put too fine a point on it, but to put a fine point on it. To what you said, J.D. Vance said, "Well, we're not. I mean, the violent perpetrators. Well, we likely won't be pardoning them, but there are others who are." He kind of put them these Oath Keeper guys and the ones to whom you've talked about. They got 20 who had 22 years, et cetera, in a separate category. And so did Pam Bondi, his new appointment for the Justice Department to be the Attorney General. She said, "Well, violent criminals will likely not be pardoned, but." Well, as it turns out, as you said, David, it was blanket.
It was blanket. It was people who committed violent crimes. And of course, one of the consequences of having a criminal conviction, we've talked about things like the Second Chance Act and things like that, to not have so many, deleterious consequences of having a felony conviction. But certainly these people should have some consequences of their felony convictions. And the reality is that all 1,500 of them have no consequences. The pardons and the commutations were structured in such a way, none of these people are even going to have a probation officer. None of them are going to be under community supervision. None are going to have the restrictions that felons normally have over purchasing and using a firearm. This is truly frightening for some of the people who, as you say, you use the expression, Trump's brown shirts. Now, they're not going to get away with the kind of awful things that the brown shirts did in Nazi Germany, because we don't have that kind of totally federal police force that Trump could in any way control, the way Hitler managed to control the forces. And so the brown shirts could attack people, protesters, people they didn't like, Jews, protesters, with impunity. We're not going to have that. And if you think about it, these blue states have to really up their game. It used to be a great thing to have the FBI and federal law enforcement, and that was a big, big deal. Oh my God, this person works for the FBI, in a way that it sort of was not to work for the equivalent state agency, let's say in New York or in California. Well, now it should be. It should be one of the most prestigious, respected jobs to be in law enforcement for the states. And all these states like California need to up their game. They need to do the things that the FBI used to be famous for and may very well cease doing in significant regards under Kash Patel if he ends up being confirmed. And that includes, in a totally lawful way, keeping tabs on people who are dangerous, coming from the extreme right wing. It used to be the police unions cared about anybody who beat up police, anybody who was terrible in the way that they acted toward the police. Now it seems like they've really given a pass. I know they've made some weak protests, but all of these police unions ought to revoke their support of Trump. They ought to say this is a bridge too far. They ought to say we were not just about whether minorities were fighting with the police. We're not just about whether so-called liberals or left-wing protesters. We, the police, mean it. We don't like when anybody beats on us. We don't like when anybody incapacitates us, put us in the hospital, has an encounter with us where 5 police officers end up dead. We really mean it. This is the end of our support for Trump. This was all very funny when he said maybe they ought to beat up the guy in the back of a squad car. Yes, we should have said more then, the police unions, when he talked about, oh, isn't that kind of nice? They beat up a guy in the back of the squad car. But this is a bridge too far. So I hope the police associations do that. I hope the district attorneys associations do that. They're all known as being right wing, being supposedly law and order. This really should be the end of that whole thing with Trump. They should be completely over Trump after this. This is awful. But I don't think that these people will go as far and do as bad things as people think, because I think that they will be, in a totally lawful way, they will come to the attention of law enforcement very quickly, especially in these blue states. Can they do terrible things in red states and get totally away with it? There is just a sense of police agencies that if someone is up to no good, they really don't look at whether you're a Democrat or Republican. I mean, police agencies, even in red states, if you're up to no good, if you're threatening people, one of the problems with people who get away with things, this has always been like the aim of the criminal sanction. If you let people get away with stuff, the next thing they'll do will be worse. So think about the next thing that some of these 1,500 people do is worse because they feel like they got away with this one.
There's that quote. I forget exactly what it is, but you may remember it. It's, for my loyal followers, they can do what they want. For those who oppose me, the law. It's it's the monarch's credo, in effect, that you will be loyal to me and I will take care of you. And if you're disloyal, I will have the full weight of the law come down upon you. So there is this asymmetry now, David, that I see it growing. And you're right to point to the states, I think, because that really is where the president won't help you. I mean, if you pull that crap in California or some of these blue states, you're going away for a long time, and President Trump can't be of any help to you.
And people say, well, in 4 years when he won't leave or when Vance won't accept they'll call on these people again and they'll summon them out. It'll be 4 years from now, Mark. Are you with me? And so this idea that there'll be his brown shirts that will come out in 3.5 years from now, a lot's going to happen between now and 3.5 years. There'll be a lot of surveillance on these people. One thing that always kind of surprised me is that the feds don't like to work with the locals. And because the feds don't like to work with the locals, we never did have companion state prosecutions. There really was no reason why a lot of these people couldn't have been simultaneously prosecuted, let's say in Maryland or Virginia, because they stayed in Maryland or Virginia. Acts of the conspiracy were done in Maryland or Virginia. They could have been prosecuted not only in the federal court, but in the state court. And then, of course, they could not have been pardoned. And they would have said, hey, have a nice life. You're going from the DC jail to the penitentiary in Maryland because now you're going to serve the state part of your sentence because you also got a consecutive state sentence. I don't say this lightly. I'm now a criminal defense attorney. But what these people did was awful. And they need to stop. These people like Trump and his followers need to stop gaslighting us. This is one that we saw on January 6th. We saw this with our own eyes. We saw this on television. We saw this on mobile devices. Over 150 police officers there, guards at the Capitol, were injured. They're still standing by there. Can you imagine what they really think when they see those right-wing Republicans come in there who cowered in fear? They didn't know that they weren't going to be the ones. All these cowards who cowered in fear, all these Republicans, and now they haven't even stood up to Trump when he gave them these pardons. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, what could they do? It's such an absolute power, this pardon power. But the fact that they haven't turned on Trump more is terrible, given that the populace is 60% against this move.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. There are millions and millions of Republicans just say who are as horrified by this as I am. And you know what's so funny? I worked with all these folks in the prosecutor's office. I would say, without seeing their registration card, most of them were Republicans. And now, of course, I worked a lot of the time under President Reagan. So I suppose it's not surprising. But many of us were Democrats like me and now Senator Adam Schiff. But this was always a Republican law and order thing. It was like, don't come to me with all these stories. Don't come to me with this happened to that person in their life. You cannot do these acts. Look at these acts. These acts need to be punished. Well, these acts on January 6th, my Lord, do they need to be punished? And the fact that they've now been treated with this impunity, it is horrible. It is scary. But I don't think that ultimately it's going to change very much in America. Of course, the people who have disrespect for the law will say, it just shows my disrespect for the law. But I think most people are coming around and saying, this is awful. This is something really terrible that Trump did. And right off the bat, people are against. This is his first major move. I know there's been a lot of other ones, but this was his first major move that really resonated, and people are repulsed by it. So good.
Well, that's why I was speaking to the audacity of it, because the reality is, as you've suggested, most Americans really weren't supporting the J6ers. So for him to lead in his first week with this blanket pardon for the J6ers, it was an audacious move. I mean, it really is. He's really testing his political currency in a lot of the ways to which you've referred. This is a question from CC Ryder, who says the civil suit filed by the Capitol Police is still proceeding, though, through the courts. The judge ruled it cannot be dismissed. Can you speak to that, David, for just an instant? I mean,
civil cases, actually, a president cannot dismiss a civil case. It's between two parties. So he can dismiss criminal cases. The civil cases stand, and any state convictions still stand. There are some of those people who have state criminal matters, so they would go from federal custody to state custody. But unfortunately, most of them were not prosecuted concurrently or simultaneously by the state authorities. One of the ones that still sticks in my craw was Manafort. They should have charged Paul Manafort in state court in New York with so many of the things that he did. They were all garden variety state felonies in New York. They figured, the feds got this one. The feds got this one. And so when he got his pardon, Manafort got all sorts of benefits. He not only got out of jail, but my understanding is that he got to keep a lot of his property, which he certainly could have argued was ill-gotten gain.
Sure.
But when his criminal case went down, so did the criminal forfeiture as part of the federal cases. And there was nobody, my understanding, he might have been civilly sued, but I don't think the state of New York ever went after him criminally and civilly in the state courts of New York the way they should have. And they ought to do that. They ought to do that in the future. Lessons learned a decade from now, things to look at in your law books.
Well, when you have nothing to do, you can Google Manafort and his daughter, and the daughter turned on him and just sort of describes the, complete depravity that is associated with Paul Manafort and corruption. I mean, he fits right into Trump land. And then and read about the outfits that he was wearing, or I think when they arrested him, or it's this bizarre sort of decadent life with like alligator boots with matching alligator long jacket. It's crazy. When that's for if those of you who want to get on the Paul Manafort deep dive.
Didn't he? By the way, speaking of California, didn't he go on some huge shopping trip in Beverly Hills that never made any sense? Why he wanted hundreds of thousands of dollars of those kind of clothes? It was like, wow, Paul, we never really knew you, did we? But now that we've seen your hundreds of thousands of dollars shopping bill, we sure have a lot of questions. And he apparently had two different brownstone houses in New York City. And anyone from New York City is so envious of someone who has one, but someone who has two and gets to keep them and is Paul Manafort. If that actually happened, talk about outrages.
Oh, my God. He had all that money from the Eastern Bloc countries, or we used to call the Eastern Bloc countries. And then, of course, here.
Ukraine, baby. Ukraine.
Yeah, Ukraine, exactly. The grift was on. Look, there's a lot going on with Donald Trump and the Constitution. He took a pledge to essentially an oath, right, to defend the Constitution. It was part of the inaugural ceremonies that many of us saw. We know that he doesn't really care about that stuff, it wouldn't seem, and witness the fact that he right away wants to take an X-Acto knife to part of the Constitution and cut out the part of birthright citizenship. Can you speak to?
Let me say one thing, Mark. Let me say one thing. Okay, you notice he did not put his hand on the Bible. That has a great deal of meaning for some people, and he didn't want to send the rotunda up in flames, so he did at least not touch the Bible for people who think that's very important. Avoiding a fire in the rotunda. His supporters already set enough fires in the rotunda 4 years ago.
Yeah, there he is taking the oath. Albert's got the picture up now with J.D. Vance looking on, et cetera, as the former President Joe Biden, et cetera. So anyway, there was this all.
By the way, Mark, have you ever seen that many white people all in one place?
Oh my God, it was extraordinary. And then they showed that, where they're looking at it on a monitor, there's like an overflow room, and it's all white faces. It was really like, wow, man, they're just. But I mean, there's really not much to the curtain's been pulled back. There's not much to the act anymore that we don't know. But yeah, you're right. So
birthright citizenship.
Yeah, so birthright citizenship. So again, he takes that oath to the Constitution. Then he, as I suggested, sort of erases part of the Constitution in his first week by executive action. Now, speak to what birthright citizenship is, please, and then speak to the legality associated with this executive order, which I don't think you can executive order your way around the Constitution, can you?
Did I agree to faithfully execute the Constitution and that oath? Wait a second. Right now, right afterwards, I am going to try to eliminate something that is black and white, clear as can be in the Constitution. So this is very interesting. 14th Amendment of birthright citizenship. So after the Civil War, freed slaves, there was a whole question about their citizenship. So this was intended to make it very clear that all of the former slaves, no matter what their condition was, no matter what their parents' conditions were, they were born in the United States. That didn't mean that people who were not former slaves and born in the United States were not citizens. It now means very clearly that everyone born in the United States, whether they're a former slave, whether their parents are legally here or not, everyone born in the United States is clearly under the 14th Amendment a citizen. Now, the only exception is this word under the jurisdiction of the United States. And that had a very specific meaning. It was foreign diplomats. Foreign diplomats and their children were not under the jurisdiction of the United States, right? That's pretty clear law. They were under the jurisdiction of their countries because they were foreign diplomats in the United States. And if a child of one of them was born here, no, that child did not automatically. And you might think, wow, they really thought that much about the problem to write that in. But from the history, that's exactly what they were thinking about when they wrote in that statement under the jurisdiction. So there is no there, Mark. On top of that, this issue came before the Supreme Court in about 1900. There is a decided Supreme Court case, precedent, stare decisis, on this point. And it's absolutely clear. It's a person of Chinese ancestry who was born in the United States. He goes out of the United States and he's not allowed to come back into the United States. And he says, wait a second, I'm a citizen with the same right to travel in and out of the United States as any other citizen. He wins. They say, look, you were born in the United States, you're a citizen. So there is no there. So this is one of those where it's just the bully pulpit. It's just Trump screaming and yelling. It's trying to intimidate people. And I don't think that this has a snowball's chance in hell of winning in the U.S. Supreme Court. Maybe the two votes who will vote for anything crazy, Alito and Thomas. I mean, they're just sort of, they're almost comic relief by now. You have to look at the other seven. But looking at the other seven, maybe Gorsuch, but I see this as 6-3. I think it gets to the U.S. Supreme Court. I think it's important enough. It gets to the U.S. Supreme Court, and I think at least 6-3. They say, read the text, dummy. Read the text, dummy. It says born in the United States, citizen.
The legal, I leave to you. The political, I take a little crack at once in a while, and I would suggest that the political part of this is what Trump does. He messages. So in this sweeping, outrageous thing that he did, where he's trying to upend this clause in the Constitution, he's sending a signal. It's all signal sending, and as you say, it'll go up, it'll get headlines, it'll be, you know, and you can see that this president tried to do what we, those who want to return America to, you know, Whitesville, whatever it's going to be, to the purity of America. This president tried to do it. He just couldn't upend the. So I think there's a political play there. Ask Katz, says Randy, about how the subject of the jurisdiction statement in the 14th Amendment applies or doesn't apply to people here illegally. Ask Katz how the subject to the jurisdiction statement in the 14th Amendment applies or doesn't apply to people who are here illegally.
Subject to it doesn't. It applies to those foreign diplomats. Again, they're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. So, I mean, just take a really clear example. The person who's here illegally in the United States, let's say who's come here, snuck in, or who's overstayed a visa, they're subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. If they speed down the street or they hit somebody, they're going to get arrested, and they're subject to the jurisdiction of the United States or one of its states. That's not true of the foreign diplomat. Remember, the foreign diplomat has immunity for stuff like that. Maybe you kick them out of the country, but you can't even maybe prosecute them for drunken driving or for hitting somebody. So it has no application. I mean, this is just not a real thing. Now, there are some countries that have laws on this. When Trump says, we're the only country in the world that has this, well, first of all, that's not even true. And what's interesting is that some countries like Canada have actually changed their law to give birthright citizenship. One thing about birthright citizenship is it's very easy to administer. And so if you think about it, among other things that would really trouble the U.S. Supreme Court, besides the language, is how incredibly difficult this is to administer. So some people are born here and become what? They don't get a birth certificate. What do they get? They become green card holders. It's awfully difficult to administer. So some countries have actually gone to birthright citizenship because it's very easy to administer. Now, what some other countries do is they do some things that you can at least argue are rational to knock down on birth tourism. Because what you always hear is, oh, it's abused. You don't hear about the 99% something where it works out just fine, but you hear about somebody who comes from China just to give birth, or someone who comes from Latin America. Those are the two that I often hear about the most. And I did have a client once, 20 years ago. And I said, have you ever been here before? Has your wife ever been here before? And he says, she just came here one time, to give birth. And yes, there are people who want to have their child be a U.S. citizen and they come here to give birth. And if you think about it, you can do some rational things to try to prevent that. If somebody's trying to get a tourist visa and they're 7 months pregnant, you can certainly inquire about that. If you have mills that you think are engaging in birth tourism that are bringing people here en masse from some country as a commercial endeavor, fight that really hard. But of course, that's not something Trump ever does. Like you said, it's all about the messaging. It's not about we're going to spend millions of dollars in rational ways to make sure people don't come here as what's basically birth tourism, just so they can come here long enough to have a kid, and the kid will have whatever benefits of being a U.S. citizen, maybe is what they call an anchor baby. I mean, some of that stuff is real. It happens in, I think, relatively small amounts. Some people would have to say it happens in larger amounts. Go deal with that. If Trump wants to deal with something, figure out rational ways to deal with real perceived problems. But this birthright citizenship is, like you say, it's a bumper sticker. It's not a real legal position.
Yeah, he's signaling, but it's a signal and a flag that'll be waved, for a change that he wants, and they'll take it all the way up as they'll continue to wave it all the way to the Supreme Court. So I want to take you to the other side of the political machination of Washington. This is the power of the purse, okay? So Washington is set up so that the president can't just decide what agencies get money and what agencies don't. That way he can't, in a sense, take aim at enemies by cutting off funding for them within the wide expanse of the federal government, except that's exactly what Donald Trump wants to do. He wants to seize that power of the purse from Congress. And this will be a tug of war, won't it, David, with the existing Congress? Because Trump has a lot of power as president, and these executive orders and his directives will be followed in large measure. But when it comes to funding and cutting off funding, that's what he wants to do, is choke off certain programs that he doesn't believe in anymore. That might be a little harder than the president just signing something and making it happen.
Well, I think it's a tug of war that he's going to lose for several reasons. Number one, if Congress cares about anything, it's power of the purse. I mean, the fact that they control the purse strings, that they control spending, that's why the lobbyists all come to them. That's why, they're kings and queens in their little realms and subcommittees where they control funding, because they have an enormous power, this power of the purse. And I don't think they're going to give it up lightly. And they'll see that while, yes, the president will try to impound funds that are going to California, and they'll all chortle because we're a blue state and they're red states, and oh yeah, California just took one. They can readily imagine that once they set a precedent for allowing that, there'll be another Democratic president soon enough, and what goes around comes around. Now, President Nixon tried to do this. This were the famous impoundment cases. I'm old enough to remember reading in college about the impoundment cases of Nixon. Nixon basically lost, that he couldn't impound funds. The argument goes legally that the right to faithfully execute the laws, to faithfully execute spending, is not spend the money, right? Somebody gives you $200 and says, go down the street and spend the money wisely. And your duty to execute the $200 spending is to say, you know what, I don't feel like spending any money, or I don't feel like spending any money at this shop or that shop. That's kind of the analogy of why faithfully execute the laws supposedly means you could faithfully execute the laws to spend money by not spending the money. The courts have said that's really an absurd argument that doesn't have any logic. There's a famous opinion, just a little bit of inside baseball, but Chief Justice Rehnquist, a legendary figure, was Nixon's, what do they call it, Office of Special Counsel. You might wonder who on earth writes these opinions like a president a sitting president can't be prosecuted. Who writes these opinions? Is there some? Yes, there's an office that does that. It's called the Office of Legal Counsel, and some legal genius is usually put in charge of it. And one of those legal geniuses was Rehnquist, who went on to be appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court by Nixon. And he wrote a memo that said that doesn't make any sense. When it says faithfully execute the laws, that doesn't mean you can't spend the money. It means you have to spend the money. So you've got that precedent, you've got that opinion, which has so much prestige. You've got the court's opinions back during the Nixon era. You've got Congress's resistance to anything that cuts back their power of the purse. So I really don't think that this is going to go anywhere. Trump may try it, and it'll be immediately challenged in court. What he'll probably do is decide to not spend money or say he can spend it more cleverly. There may be some little things that he can do, like, if there really is something that makes sense, like someone comes along and says, I know you're entitled to spend 100 billion on this by spending it 50 and 50, and you could actually buy it. You could buy it for 80, right? You could buy twice as much for 80. Yes, maybe you could do that. Say, you know what? I had authority to spend 50 and 50. I spent 80 to buy the same thing because I bought it all at once. Something sensible like that, the courts might approve. But anything more than that, anything that smacks of political retaliation, not spending it in one of the states, it's approved. It's like, remember the infrastructure money. It's as though they'd approve the infrastructure money with all those. They did have some Republican votes for infrastructure. Whether they had some or they didn't have any, it was designated, earmarked to certain places. Biden couldn't have come along and said, I'm only going to spend it in blue states. Now that I have the power to spend it, I'll only spend 60% of it because I'll only spend it in blue states. The other 40% that would have gone to red states, I won't spend that at all. If Trump tries to do anything like that, it's going nowhere, Mark.
Well, you so rightly talk about that impoundment and Nixon, and it was sort of a dead issue, and it doesn't really seem to take the stress test that you've just kind of given us an example of. But the guy who's going to run OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, is the guy who is really one of the key architects of Project 2025. And so this is the political side. Again, just to put some specifics on it, this guy, Russell, it looks like it would be Vought. I think he pronounces his last name Vote. But anyway, it's Vought. But so he's trying to get that thing that you're talking about, the notion of preventing the spend, that he essentially, Trump, could be the architect of what areas of government get less in the way of spend, that history of empowerment that you were talking about. He's trying to make that something that is getting into the zeitgeist to the point that becomes a legitimate question again. So even as you say, and game it out for us and say it really probably won't stand any kind of constitutional test or legal test, the word within the Project 2025 people who are really controlling so much of the specifics of the Trump White House right now is, hey, we're going to try to make this happen. We're going to try to get this through. But your point is, I don't care how much buzz there is about it. It just is going to be something that Congress won't want to let go of.
Congress won't want to let go of it. And to the extent that there's a conflict between the president, the executive branch, and Congress, the case will go to the courts. And I think the good thing about this one is that people will have standing. A lot of times they avoid these things when there's administration overreach. No one can quite get to it to challenge it in court because the particular plaintiff doesn't have standing. But I think they'll be standing here because the person who has the funds impounded will have standing. And
Sure.
So when they don't spend it at your store or they don't spend it in your state because it's blue, the person who didn't get the money spent will run to court and say, hey, there's $1 billion hole where Congress appropriated money and Trump didn't give it to me. And I sure as hell have standing. Give me the $1 billion that was appropriated and that Trump didn't spend. So I think that this is kind of, they're doing a lot of these wacky things that are going to be struck down by the courts. I don't care if it's a Trump-picked judge or an Obama or, Bush, Biden-picked judge. There is a legal consensus on a lot of these issues. And I think the ones that you've mentioned so far are going nowhere as a legal matter. And at some point, it's embarrassing to keep losing. Even if you're Trump, it's embarrassing to keep losing. I mean, a lot of us think of him as a big loser who just runs his mouth and then loses and loses and loses. But he's going to have a streak. He's going to be on a losing streak in so many of these. And he'll say it's the liberals, it's the Biden judges, but it won't be. It'll be the judiciary in general, and it'll be Congress standing up for itself, even though both houses are Republican, especially those Republican senators. It's 53-47. They can never get anything past a filibuster there. People who are worried about legislation, they're not going to get anything through the filibuster. The reconciliation process, Mark, is difficult. It has to be really right on point. I know they try to get a parliamentarian, say it's right on point. They try to push the parliamentarian around. But they all know in the Senate that what goes around comes around. So if you push, and few years, you have a Democrat, and they push back, and they cite your precedents, and they do to you what you just did to them a couple of years before.
Although the Democrats never really seem to strike back quite as hard. That might change, and maybe
Yeah.
Democratic Party 2.0 will do that. Kurt asks this: The Mark Thompson Show, aren't executive orders limited by time and must be ratified by Congress to make permanent, or does that only apply to declarations of war, since that costs money? Kurt
Well,
asks.
we haven't had a declaration of war in a while, I think, right?
Yeah, that's
Uh,
kind of the problem, is that we just go to war without the declaration. Yeah.
yeah. Think Vietnam conflict, the
Thank you.
Vietnam conflict. But the question was about executive orders. If an executive order is proper, it becomes law if it's within the scope of the president's executive authority to do something. So it may be delegated, and then the president acts in a way that was delegated to the president. But the president may also overreach and do something that conflicts either with a ruling of a court, or may be something that's not within the president's power, or a congressional statute may say the president can do this, but only this. And the president says, no, I want to do a lot more. And so that's why a lot of these executive orders get challenged, the ones that Biden kept issuing to reduce student debt. And it seemed to me like good ideas. I mean, all these corporations get all these huge breaks. Some poor student kid gets some slack on his or her student loan. But they kept saying it was beyond the president's power. And so they struck down those executive orders in the court. And at least the last word on them by the Supreme Court were some of them, at least according to the majority of the U.S. Supreme Court, were beyond the executive power. So it's not like an executive order stands for 3 months, if but only if Congress joins it. That would be a bill. The executive order, it's good or it's not good because the president had authority. If the president had authority, it's within the authority, then it stands. It's law.
Yeah, it stands alone. I want to, and just another minute or so, David, you're so great to give us your time. He came with this fire hose of executive orders, so you'll pardon, I'm kind of jumping from one to one. But Trump has revoked the executive order banning discrimination in federal contracting. The decades-old order had undermined, quote, our national unity. He, this week, in an executive order that was aimed at banning discrimination by federal contractors and subcontractors as part of, this effort to open up government to sort of equality of hiring and of awarding these contracts. They say, the Trump White House said, that they've signed this order to protect the civil rights of all Americans and expand individual opportunities by terminating radical DEI preferencing in federal contracting and directing federal agencies to relentlessly combat private sector discrimination. They've turned the DEI effort to sort of try to reach out to minority contracts. They've turned that into the notion that by doing that, you're ignoring the mainstream majority, read white people, et cetera, those who might have been neglected by such a thing, that they are kind of being excluded. So again, and then I'll let you speak, the order that he's revoking, okay, just to be clear about what it is, had required, and this is a quote, affirmative action and prohibits federal contractors from discriminating on the basis of race, color, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, or national origin. Okay, so this goes back to LBJ, who initially covered government employees, and then it applies to government contracts. Can you speak to this and this executive order and how it may have a practical applicability?
Well, I think it will have some practical applicability, especially if he has all of these Trump loyalists, in these high positions inside these agencies. They certainly will not engage in the DEI efforts that high officials in the Biden administration engaged in. I mean, I just couldn't disagree with Trump, I guess, philosophically more. I was a law clerk to an African-American judge, picked by President Jimmy Carter at the age of 49. And he was totally outstanding. Now, someone could stand on the sidelines and say that, well, he was a DEI pick. I just have no idea what they supposedly mean by that. He was a great judge. He was terrific. He was affirmed by the higher courts all the time. He served a distinguished career. I also worked in 1980 in the office of the Solicitor General in the summer for Wade McCree Wade McCree was African American, also picked by Jimmy Carter, but he'd been picked before that as a federal appellate judge. And I think he was originally picked by a Republican. So it just cannot be that every time a woman or a person of color advances, that people are screaming, well, they just got it on account of DEI. And the idea of DEI is not to have quotas, but to do outreach and to find outstanding people. And I don't know, maybe because we live out here on the coast, maybe because we have common sense, but this world that Trump and his backers see, where people who are not just as well qualified, women and people of color who are not just as well qualified as males or white people, I just don't see this world happening. But they see this world, and they think it's a zero-sum game, and they think that they think that males and people who are not of color are getting some kind of bad shake, and they're going to try to do something about it. And I guess it's going to end up in the courts. I don't think that they can say somebody was a, quote, DEI hire, and they could take that person who served great at some job for 5 years and somehow demote them or treat them differently, saying they were DEI hire. So I think most of the threat is prospective, to not have as vigorous outreach programs. And I guess anyone who thinks that they are being treated unfairly, they could sue, just like people sue right now, and they say that I was treated unfairly because I was white, because I'm a person of color, because I'm a man or a woman, and they try to make a case why that person has personally been treated unfairly in some way. But we've had this since the Bakke decision. I was at Berkeley, and my Berkeley professors in law school argued for the University of California. They argued against Bakke, who claimed that the University of California had set-asides for minorities, and that but for the 10 places that had been set aside at medical school at a University of California campus for persons of color, that Bakke would have gotten in. And then there were all these great arguments that, wait a second, 10 places were set aside for children of doctors. Why don't you complain about that? But setting aside places for doctors' kids wasn't equal protection, and setting aside places for people of color, if that's what they were doing, and they were really quotas. And that's the famous case where the U.S. Supreme Court said you can't have quotas, but you can do things to have a more diverse student population or have a more diverse workforce. And we've had these huge fights, and there's thousands and thousands of lawsuits about that ever since.
Sure. I mean, that's like, I'll know it when I see it type thing, or with the discrimination. D. Elliott says, but David, they are already doing that, putting all the DEI hires on leave before firing them. That was something that was just done yesterday, in the last 36 hours, I think.
They'll probably be at court in the next 36 hours. One thing that was really interesting, just tell a little personal history, but I think it's really relevant here. I was a law clerk from 1980 to late 81, which meant that I was in Washington, D.C., working for a Carter-picked U.S. district judge when Reagan came to power. And our court and all the other courts in Washington, D.C., U.S. district courts, the federal courts, had a huge number of lawsuits. They had what they called reduction in force under Reagan. Reagan had said that he would get rid of the education department. He said he'd get rid of some other department. And he started having these reductions in force, which were called RIFs. And so these workers came in, these federal employees who'd been RIFed, and they came in and they asked for injunctions, and they said that they shouldn't be treated just the way Trump is treating these people. So they'll get good representation. They have federal employee unions that will be litigating these issues. And we'll as Trump says, we'll see.
Trevor Starr in Hollywood says, MAGA loves the new DEI, discrimination, exclusionism, and insidiousness. That's right. And that's impressive. And
he could put idiocy in there sometimes.
I think there's going to be
idiocy.
Exclusionism, I think, is a new word too. I don't believe it exists, but I might be wrong about that. I mean, it's possible.
Google it.
I don't know. It could be.
You don't have your ding. You don't have your ding anymore, Mark.
I don't. I've been laying off the ding. I got a little grief about the ding. I don't like the ding. It's too much. So we do it from time to time. It's as a reminder. But you're right. I don't.
To not have the ding, it's like William F. Buckley firing line. It's such an intellectual interchange without the ding.
and then to have the ding come in.
It's fun with the ding. William F. Buckley and Gore Vidal would have liked it more if they'd had a ding. When you
Oh,
see William F. Buckley's firing line when I was a kid, you not only got a great exchange about the issues of the day, but you had 3 or 4 words to look up afterwards.
it was terrific. It really was true. I still look at the YouTube videos of Vidal and Buckley, and it's wonderful. So, David, we've reached the end of our time. I love what we covered, and I know that there's way more to cover. When you have a lawless administration, it's good to have a lawyer to kind of point it out. And I appreciate this is. I'm just trying to see if there's any last comment.
Mark, let me tell you while you're looking.
Yeah,
When I was on
please.
CNN, when I was on CNN's newsroom a lot in 18 and 19, people used to say, when Trump goes, your whole circus is going to go. And I said, you know what? If Trump will sign that he'll go, I'll sign that I'll go. I'll sign that if Trump will go, the Katz circus will go. Well, Trump never went anywhere. I never went anywhere. But it really is deja vu all over again to have
It is.
Trump.
This deja vu is even harder. I mean,
astonishing. It's really mind blowing.
Yeah. Okay. Randy says, please clarify. Okay, I'll clarify. The DEI hires, if there are such things, he says, are not being put on leave. It's the people that work in the DEI offices that are being put on leave. Yeah, they're government offices. There's a government office of DEI that essentially is trying to see to it that the American government respects DEI, and I guess that's the sort of work they do. So diversity, equity, inclusion should be part of the ethic and the philosophy that underpins the federal government. There's an office to that. Well, Trump said, "Great, you're all going home. We're still paying you. We're going to figure out what happens with your office." So, DK rocks. David K. David K. Let me just get through the compliments, please. K. Plant says that. Kurt gives you the applause. You have a lot of love in our audience, David Katz, so thank you. Now, what were you going to say?
I say it's great to be on with you. Apparently Trump is keeping almost none, maybe none, of the U.S. attorneys, which is ironic because the offices will be run by the deep state, the career guys after all of the politically appointed U.S. attorneys in the 94 districts are gone. But I'm going this afternoon to the going away party for the U.S. attorney in the Central District of California, my old office. And he's done a wonderful job in so many ways, but that's it. They're going to be new U.S. attorneys. The only good news is that Adam Schiff is on the committee. So if there are real turkeys in there, I hope Schiff will get to the bottom of that, just like if there are real turkeys among the judge picks, Schiff will be on that Judiciary Committee to get to the bottom of it. I know they don't have the votes, but they can bring a lot of things to light.
There is this to button out with this. Trevor Starr in Hollywood did go to Wikipedia. He did Google it, and exclusionism is the political ideology and practice of excluding people from the community, especially in the context of ethnic nationalism, racism, or xenophobia. So I stand corrected, and Trevor, bravo. Very, very well done with exclusionism is an actual word and an actual philosophy. There you go. David, that Constitution is going to be getting a real workout in the next week. We'll talk to you next week. Thanks, David Katz. Appreciate it.
Got to keep your Constitution right in your pocket. Got to keep your little copy of the Constitution right in your pocket. You remember that guy from the Democratic Convention?
Oh, yeah. Trump insulted his son, and he went to his son had given his life for the country. It's crazy.
Great to be with you, Mark. Hi,
Wild
Kim.
times. Yep. All right, David. See you next week. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.